Good morning everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on 6 common mistakes when telling your story. One of the things when we're presenting, training, teaching, even facilitating is the power of telling and sharing your story. All the great speakers around the world tell their story. They've got a story that has impact, that influences and creates change or creates movement. So with story being such a important part of presentation skills and public speaking, it's probably important that we take the opportunity to get the stories correct. So I'm just going to run through with you 6 common mistakes that I know of, that I see when people tell their story. And a lot of these mistakes come from my own experience. So Peter Dew is my name. Most of you know me, though I are seeing a couple of new names. I'm a public speaking trainer and coach, and I'm also a person who stutters. So I've found my way from being afraid and unable to speak to doing this for my living, which is a little bit bizarre, but it's a really great way for me to deal with my stuttering, with my fear. And I love to help people unlock their potential, unlock their voice, so that you guys out there can share your passion, your message, the knowledge with the people that need to hear it. If you haven't done a webinar before, how to participate, please ask questions as we go. Don't wait for me to stop and say, are there any questions? I do have a couple of slides within the presentation where I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions. But anytime you can type into the dialogue box and say, Peter, can you explain this? Also, feel free to comment, so don't limit yourself to questions. Please say, look, I agree, or I don't agree with that, or even give me an example. Take notes. Think about what I'm talking to you and think, how can you apply this to an upcoming presentation? Or how could have you done a previous presentation differently to be more impactful by using some of the information? So it's not just about taking on the information, it is about applying the information. How could you apply this in your real life, in your real presentation skills journey? And those of you who are just joining us, we're just getting underway. So do ask questions. You can put your hand up if you want to, and I will open up your microphone and you can ask the question and everyone will hear you. Otherwise, just type into the dialogue box. Okay, that's probably enough in terms of introduction and how to participate. So why stories? As I mentioned, all the great speakers tell stories, but there is some psychology and some science behind storytelling. If you tell people some facts, you give them some information, some data, and you tell them the way it is, then the retention rate is about 10%. So tomorrow when I bump into you in the street and say, can you remember what that person spoke about 1 in 10 of you will remember. If you add some visuals, so your PowerPoint, you draw on the flip chart or the whiteboard, you provide a handout for people to look at, then you're increasing that retention rate up to around 30%. And as you know, some people are audio learners, some people are visual learners, and some people are kinesthetic learners. If you tell a story that has got examples, it's engaging and it creates emotion, and the emotion is important, then your attention can increase to 65 to 70%, 75% depending on the data you read. And so it comes down to creating what we call a visceral response. From this webinar, you won't remember much of what I've told you, but you'll remember more of how I made you feel. Yeah? So you won't remember much of the data, you won't remember much of the slides, but if in telling you a story, you feel, aha, I can do that, I can deal with my fear, I can overcome adversity, I can see light at the end of the tunnel, then you will remember that experience. So you won't remember much of what I've said, but you'll remember how I've made you feel. And maybe my little introduction that I'm a person who stutters. And here I am speaking to you and travelling around Australia helping people become more effective public speakers. Maybe that gives you encouragement. Maybe that helps you deal with your own fear or your own ambitions. So that's why we tell stories. The stories are to take people on an emotional journey to create impact and to help persuade people, and of course be memorable. Be memorable. That's why we tell stories. Okay, so what are, and a few people still joining, what are the 6 common mistakes that people make? So this is kind of the agenda. The first mistake is not using your own stories, your own personal stories. The second mistake is not letting the audience know in advance that you're going to tell them a story, that you've gone from data or information to now you're telling a story. So please, you need to let the audience know. Using the wrong story for the wrong audience, and we call this framing. Using old stories. Those stories that we hear over and over again, and surely not another speaker is going to use that same metaphor or that same story. We've heard it before. Making yourself the hero of your story. And having to explain or interpret the story. So what I mean by telling that story is, so they are the common mistakes. Let me go through those one by one. So mistake number 1 is not using your own personal stories. It's important that you don't rely solely on other people's stories. I was working with someone the other day and he told me a story. That reminds me of a story. So use your own personal stories. So my story of overcoming adversity around public speaking, overcoming my fear, helps people have confidence that I'm the right person because I've been there, I've done that. So your stories will help give you credibility. If you have overcome adversity, if you have been successful in putting a project team together, if you have dealt with difficult people and resolved conflict successfully, that's your story, that's your example. Or as opposed to you're reading in a book about this conflict and this is how person A and person B resolve the conflict. That is someone else's story. And part of the credibility is when people probe or ask questions. Can you tell me a little bit more about that problem solving or that negotiation that you told us about? How did those people get into that circumstance? And then if I'm using someone else's story, my response would be, look, I don't know. They didn't mention that part of it. In reading the journal article, I didn't see or didn't tell us how they got into those circumstances. Where if it's your story, your case study, and you've worked with that client or that family or that difficult customer, you own that story. So don't rely on other people's stories. Your stories will also help you connect. So it's about helping build rapport. And those of you who are not on my newsletter yet, just go to my website and subscribe. I'm about to send out a newsletter this week about sharing your vulnerability. And part of your vulnerability is your story when something went wrong or you weren't as confident as you'd hoped to be. And when you share that in the right setting, it helps you build rapport and connection with your audience. It's part of your story. So please don't rely on other people's stories. It lacks credibility. It doesn't show that you've done that journey. And when people ask questions or probe or want to dig deeper, you may not have the information from the other person's story. So use your stories. You own them. They're yours. They're your unique intellectual property. No one can dispute that it didn't happen. So please use your own personal stories. The second mistake is not letting the audience know in advance. And I am guilty of this very often. I give some information in my workshops and then I start describing a conference. And some people that are very analytical, they get lost. And they say, so Peter, is this in the notes, or is this still about this topic you've just talked about, or is this about the PowerPoint slide? And then I have to say, no, I do apologise. Let me tell you a story that illustrates that point. Look, I have a story to share with you that I think will further add some detail to what I'm trying to show, will further demonstrate. That reminds me of a story. So let the audience know, pave the way for them that there's a story. So one of the things I teach people in your storytelling and in your presentation is you need to know your audience inside out. You need to know if there's any cultural awarenesses, any cultural nuances, what their values are, what they want to get from your workshop. You really need to know your audience inside out. And that's one of the golden rules of public speaking. Who is going to be in the room and what are their expectations? I teach that all the time. I once made a mistake. Not once, I often make mistakes. Let me share with you a story where I really mucked up. I was recently in Nepal speaking to a group of Nepalese people who invited me there to speak around presentation skills. I started by saying, who's heard of Steve Jobs? Each of them in the room, all 35 of them, just a small group, bobbed their head from side to side as if to say no. And I said again, surely you must have heard of Steve Jobs. They all bobbed their head from side to side again, as if to say no. I pulled a phone out of my pocket, an iPhone, and said, you know, iPhone, the inventor of the iPhone, the inventor of Apple, Steve Jobs. They all bobbed their head from side to side, and a young man down the front said, Peter, we've all heard of Steve Jobs. And then it dawned upon me. I was in Nepal. They were all Hindu people, and the bob from side to side as if to say no means yes. So what I say to you all is when you walk into a room to present to a group of people, make sure you know who's in the room. Are there any cultural nuances you need to be aware of? Who are the traditional landowners? What are the values and the vision of the people in that room? And make sure your message meets their needs. Little story to illustrate a point. Quite embarrassing because I knew that Hindu people do bob their head from side to side, and I just walked in thinking I was just going to present my normal content, no worries, no need to prepare, I'll just go in and do it, and I looked silly. You need to let the audience know that you're about to tell them a story. The stories can illustrate a point. So Peter, what do you mean by? What do you mean by you need to know your audience? Well, let me share a little story with you. Mistake number 3, using the wrong story. So this is about framing, and this is why you need to know your audience. If you use a story that's not appropriate for that audience, you may get a disconnect, or they may not understand it. I work a lot with financial planners. I work a fair bit with the mining sector, Chevron, Rio, and BHP. I need to use different stories for different audiences. I also work with health professionals. Health professionals, once again, need a different group of stories. So choosing the appropriate story for your audience will make you have greater impact, and it will show that you know your audience. And even if you have the same story, you can put the right spin on, the right slant for a different audience. Now let me give you a small example. Now I have done a lot of work with the Heart Foundation. And they talk about the heart being the most magnificent organ, the most magnificent pump known to mankind. In an average lifetime, it pumps 350 million litres of blood. So when I'm working with the mining sector, the oil and gas sector, I then equate that 350 million litres of blood to 3 super tankers full of oil. So in an average lifetime, your heart will fill 3 super tankers full of oil. That's how much 350 million litres is. I'm off to Bendigo later this week, and I'll be working with Colaban Water. So Colaban is the water authority for the Bendigo, the Greater Bendigo area. So when I use 350 million litres, I don't talk about 3 super tankers of oil. I say, so 350 million litres. Someone's just said, yay, I'm coming back to Bendigo. I've got someone from Bendigo on the webinar. So 350 million litres. What I want you to do tonight, all of you on this webinar, when you go home tonight, turn on your kitchen tap for 45 years, full bore, and leave it running for 45 years. That's 350 million litres. So that's framing. When I speak to the mining, the oil and the gas, I talk about super tankers. When I'm speaking with Colaban Water, with the Water Authority of West Australia, when I'm down in Maffra later on in May, Southern Rural Water, I'm going to talk about turn your kitchen tap on full bore for 45 years. By the way, everyone, please don't go home and do that. Don't turn your tap and leave it running for 45 years. You're going to waste a lot of water. So framing is about choosing the right story for different audiences. And so you might have different stories, or you've got one really good seminal story, and then you put the right slant. So you pick the point from that story for one particular presentation or for one particular audience. A recent example that I've heard about was that Andrew Robb, our Federal Minister for Agriculture and Trade, was speaking in January to a big conference, big consortium in India. And he was talking about free trade and the value of free trade, and he was talking about how brilliant it was that Australia was exporting millions of beef to the Chinese market. A group of Australian delegates were in the room and they kind of cringed, some West Australians, and they told me about it. So Andrew Robb is speaking to an audience of 30,000 business people from India, predominantly Hindu, and he's talking about eating beef, and he's talking about Chinese people, and the Indians and the Chinese are still quite strong rivals. So maybe I wouldn't have used that story for that audience if that was me. And certainly the Australians that were in the audience did sort of gasp and bury their head just a little bit. So that's making sure you don't use the wrong story for the wrong audience. And if you're unsure, test it. Test the story for appropriateness. I'm going to pause for a moment. Are there any questions? Any further comments? And Claire, yes, I'm coming back to Bendigo. So are you going to look out for me? Are you coming to any of my workshops? We'll talk about that towards the end. Aha, someone's going to my wife's session. Thanks, Claire. Okay, so please keep writing comments and questions. Don't wait for me to pause for questions. Using old stories, stories that have been worn to death. We've all heard of them. You know that saying, if you give a man some fish and then you can feed him for a day, or you can feed his family for a day, but if you teach him how to fish, then really you're going to feed him and feed his family for a lifetime. So I want to talk about giving you a skill that's going to feed you for a lifetime. I mean, it's a fair metaphor, but I've heard it over and over again. So if you are going to borrow some metaphors or borrow some stories, try and come up with some original ones. If you will allow me, worn to death. Yes, so I've got a spelling mistake in my heading. Thank you for that. Should be worn to death, so that should be an O. So just be careful with those old stories that are worn to death. Try and come up with fresh stories or your own examples. Another one that I hear a lot is around the fear of your public speaking. And the fear of your public speaking, you know, before you speak, you get those butterflies in your stomach. It's the nerves are like the butterflies. I've heard that over and over again. So I talk about your nerves are like wild horses. Your nerves, before you stand up to speak before 150 people, are like wild horses. Don't shoot them. Instead, tame them and harness them, and they'll take you on the ride of your life. So in other words, don't get rid of the nerves, rather learn to harness that nervous energy, and you'll be a really great presenter and public speaker. So I've got a question. What happens if the story you tell makes you emotional? Great for impact, but if not, if you break down. Look, there's several things you can do with the emotional stories. It is, and I wrote a whole newsletter on this, I think last month. So one thing you can do is move. So when you feel the emotions coming, move to a different position in the platform. So you're now disassociating yourself with that emotion. You feel the emotion, step aside and then continue on with the story, and leaving that emotional space back where you were, and just go through the story. Another tip is to breathe deep, focus on the deep breathing. One of the non-verbal resting positions is to put your hands on your belly button. It's parallel to the ground, and you can just check that your belly button is moving in and out. If your belly button's not moving in and out, then you're not breathing deeply and you're more prone to an emotional response. Another tip is, and this comes from my own, so let me share with you my story. This comes from my own story of delivering my father's eulogy. Very emotional, delivering my father's eulogy. Focus on the people in the room that are there as supporters just to say goodbye to my father, as opposed to focusing on those people that are also sucked up in your emotional story and your emotional journey. So the mistake I made was I glanced down to the front row where my two brothers were sitting, and I noticed that they were crying, tears were running down their face, and they were very emotional. This triggered that emotion within me, and I quickly moved my eye contact back up to those people that are farming friends of my dad's, old colleagues. They're there because he was a good man. They're not on the same emotional journey. And I drew strength from those people, and I avoided the people that were experiencing the same emotional journey as was in my story, i.e. I did not look back at my brothers again during the eulogy. There's 4 or 5 other tips. They're in my last month's newsletter, so Claire and anyone else, send me an email and I can send you last month's newsletter with all the tips around how to deal with emotions. So try and choose news stories, and I will fix that spelling. Another mistake that people do is they make themselves the hero. So I'm a person who stutters. I do public speaking training for my living. I am a hero. I overcome my adversity. I'm really good. No, don't do that. Make the audience the hero. So I've lived my life with a fear of public speaking, but I want you guys out there to go out, to change the world, to share your passion, your knowledge, your experience, to help people that are stuck in their lives. You've got the message, you've got the knowledge. So go out there and change the world one conversation at a time. That's my challenge to all of you. I want you to go out there and use your voice. Be passionate. Don't be afraid. How can you make your audience the hero of your story? The story may be about you, but you need to turn it outward. Public speaking is not about you. Public speaking is about the audience. In a previous career, I used to work with organ donation and transplantation. I managed WA's organ donation agency. So let me share with you just one little story with that career. We put together a great event where we had about 150 people in the room, and they were mostly donor families or friends or brothers or sisters of someone who had died and donated an organ to give someone a second chance of life. Or maybe they've donated some bone upon death, or even a cornea to restore life to someone who was blind. And we got a guest speaker who happened to be West Australia's first heart and lung double organ recipient. And he was really grateful, and he was only a young man. He was in his early 40s and had a 10, 12-year-old son that he'd never been able to play football with, or soccer or cricket. So this man was our guest speaker at this seminar, which was basically acknowledging families and organ donors. And he spoke about his life and how much the heart transplant had meant to him and how he could now run around and play football with his son. And he said, I really need to thank two people. I need to thank my wife for supporting me all these years, and I need to thank the transplant surgeon, the clever man, the brilliant man that saved my life. The hero of that story is the donor families. The hero are the people that have the courage to donate organs at the worst time of their life. They've just lost a husband, a wife, a family member. This speaker missed the point by a long shot. Most of the people, as we're having a supper afterwards, said, I'm not sure that I support organ donation anymore. If that's the kind of person who receives transplants, I'm not quite sure. So make sure you make the audience the hero, and all this person had to say is, and we're so grateful for all of you for supporting organ donation. We know many of you have made brave decisions. Turn it out to the audience. You are not the hero of your story. Having to explain the story, please. So what I mean by telling my story is, this is like having to explain the punchline of your joke. Make sure people get the meaning of your story. They're the 6 common mistakes. Any last questions? Please type them in. Upcoming workshops, so Bendigo, 26th, 27th, then off to Mildura, then off to Echuca. What a tough life I have. Got some presentation skills in Perth, and I've got some workshops in Melbourne coming up in May as well. So please share the information with your friends and your colleagues. If you're not on our newsletter yet, you should sign up at our website. So www.peterdew.com.au. Upcoming webinars for April. Should we reveal our vulnerability as speakers and trainers? Or is it a sign of weakness? Or will someone turn it against us? How to nail your question and answer session, especially when you've got a heckler or tough people in the room. And April, from a public speaking perspective, some job interview tips. So how do you present effectively at job interview? All my webinars, they're not on the website yet, but I'll put them up shortly for April. Just go to my website and /webinars. Any final questions? As I sum up, do use your own personal stories. Let me reflect this in a positive. Do use your own personal stories. That's much more preferential. Let the audience know that you're about to tell a story. Frame it for that right audience, or put the right slant, or grab the core message from within the story that matches that audience's needs. Don't keep telling the same old stories that are WORN, worn to death. Don't make yourself the hero of the story. Do make the audience the hero of the story, and choose stories that people get the message.